Welcome to this, our latest NY-LON Simultaneous Seminar. I'd like to first of all thank KPF for hosting the event and also the Forum and Institute for Urban Design for their support. I'm Peter Murray, I'm Chairman of NLA, and this debate really forms part of the discussions that surround an exhibition we have in our exhibition space at the moment, called London's Growing Up, which is an exhibition about the new spate of towers which are about to appear on London's skyline. And this has caused a considerable amount of interest in the press in the UK and around the world. And one of the interesting elements of it is about should London have a more rule-based planning system. And what we wanted to investigate today is the different approaches to planning for tall buildings in both cities, to see what we can learn from each other. So we're going to go to New York now, and Bill Menking, Editor-in-Chief of the Architects newspaper, will welcome us. So over to you, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And hello, good afternoon, London. And in New York, it's just 9 o'clock. We want to welcome all of you here for the fifth in the series of our New York, London, or what I like to call NY-LON Simultaneous Seminars, coping with the rise of tall residential towers. And I suppose, oddly enough, though New York has so many skyscrapers, this current state of new skyscrapers going up, particularly in Midtown Manhattan on 57th Street, several of them downtown as well, are also extremely controversial, as I know they are in London. So let's get started. I want to introduce the managing principal, Paul Katz, who will, from KPF, who will introduce, get us started with the beginning here. Paul.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill and Peter, and welcome to all. The debate's already started this morning here in our offices in New York, and I wasn't sure whether I was in New York or London and whether we're for or against it. One of the things that's unique, Peter, in our conversations in New York and London is this is the first time in a long time that there are tall buildings being built at the same time, both in New York and in London, both residential and commercial buildings. So it's a unique moment in history where the two most important cities or metropolises in the world, or leading cosmopolitan cities, as Peter would say, are both seeing this tremendous growth. And I think what I'd like to see out of this discussion is to see, we're not going to agree on everything, but what values we share. And there are many values we share, but there are very deep differences in how we, our attitudes to the city and urban culture, both in New York and London. So it'll be interesting to know both of us better, but different. So Bill, who's the first presenter? Okay, Peter, there's nobody better to explain the shared values and differences than yourself.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I just wanted to do a brief presentation really to look at some of the issues we raised in the exhibition, but also to explain to our audience in New York a little bit about how planning for tall buildings operates in London. And one of the key issues that we deal with here is essentially that the key piece of legislation is about where we can't build tall buildings rather than where we can. And these images you see on the screen now are the view corridors, which are protected. And you can see here the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament in Big Ben, and here is St Paul's Cathedral. And views from the distance, from up on the hills above London, on Primrose Hill and the Hampstead Heath, these views are protected. You can't build a tall building which would obscure that view of St Paul's. And then around St Paul's itself there are what we call St Paul's heights, which control the height of building around St Paul's, again so that the view of the dome is not obscured. But there are areas where at the moment now tall building is being permitted and indeed in some cases encouraged, and these are what are called opportunity areas under the London plan. and you can see the centred around the Thames here through to the east, where we had the Olympic Games, and in the centre around the West End and the city. So these are generally brownfield sites or second-hand land which are being redeveloped to much higher densities to feed the growth for London. One of the key issues we have to take into account in this discussion is that London is growing. We're sort of 8.3 million people at the moment. We're likely to grow to about 10 million people by 2031. And so we have to house a lot more people, we have to develop a lot more, we have to create the infrastructure to provide the necessary amenities for a population of that size. As you get further towards the centre, there are a number of areas where the GLA, Greater London Authority planners, suggest are good places to put tall buildings. Not the green ones, of course, these are the protected areas, Tower of London and here Palace of Westminster. But here you have the City of London, what is called the Eastern Cluster, and the south bank of the Thames, which at the moment is relatively tower-free, but we'll be seeing a lot more over the next few years. And down to the south here, we see an area called Nine Elms next to Battersea Power Station, where there is a concentration of tall buildings around one existing building, which was originally put there as a sort of landmark rather than as a part of a cluster. And this is the Nine Elms area. You can see Battersea Power Station is to the left of the picture. You have a lower rise area, and this, of course, is the US Embassy, which we're moving to the site in a few years' time. And then, as you get closer to central London, you have this series of tall buildings which create a cluster, which can be seen on axis looking up from the Thames past the Palace of Westminster. And this is a view of that opportunity area. Again, on the right-hand side, we have Battersea Power Station, lower buildings, and then a tall cluster at the end here. A cluster that has been slightly rearranged over the last year or so. This building was going to be the pinnacle of this cluster, but now actually KPF are designing a new tower here, which will will change slightly the composition with the view that that is a rather more elegant way of putting a series of buildings together. And this is the eastern cluster of the City of London, where you have Raphael Vignoli's, what we call here the walkie-talkie, and this is Roger Stirk Harbour, the Cheese Grater or the Leadenhall building, and this is the Pinnacle, also designed by KPF, which at the moment is partly under construction, but has slowed down, I think, for financial reasons. And this is another view of that. And this cluster really has happened because this is on the east side of the city, where there are no protected views, and also where there are no conservation areas, which actually cover quite a large part of the city. And to explain how the view corridors impact on the design of buildings, this is the Leadenhall building by Roger Stirk Harbour. And this is the view of the building looking down Fleet Street. Fleet Street has an axial view to St Paul's Cathedral from the west. And the design of the building here, as you see in the drawing on the left, the design of the building tips away from the dome of St Paul in order not to impinge on that particular view. So this is fundamentally a contextual building which, might say, doffs its hat at St Paul's in a very different way than many other buildings do in terms of their context. And this is a view of looking towards the eastern cluster here. This is an image of around 2007. You can see relatively few tall buildings there. Canary Wharf is way in the distance along the river, and here are a couple of towers which have been there since the 1970s, and this is an image of what it is likely to look like within the decade if all the buildings which are proposed actually go ahead. So this is a substantial change in the skyline of London, one which is welcomed by some and criticised by others. The London Live television programme has just had a poll today. Actually, the results were out at lunchtime, and they asked people whether they disapproved or approved of the impact tall buildings were having on London skyline. 52% of people approved, 48% disapproved. And so I was asked on the London Live television programme what I thought of it, and my view was that's a majority. If you're a government, you would get in. So, the impact of this is happening in other areas. This is a view of Canary Wharf in East London, which has one Canada Square as the pinnacle of that particular cluster. And there are now proposals of a whole series of towers which would radically change that cluster. And we will hear later today about very interesting parts of the planning process where we could at least try and ameliorate the impact of that on the area. And then this final slide is the view of that cluster down at Vauxhall, 9 Elms that I was talking about. This is what it may look like in a decade or so, and will be very different to what it is now. And our exhibition really we designed in order to generate a debate and discussion, because we believe that it's the sort of thing that Londoners should know about, and London should be in a position to debate and discuss so that they know what is happening to their city. So that really gives, I hope, you a picture in New York of where we're at the moment in London, and perhaps I could now pass over to Bill again, and he's going to introduce the second speaker. Bill, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was very helpful for us here in New York to see all those challenges and problems and opportunities of new high-rise construction in London. I want to introduce the new friend of mine and the new executive director of the Municipal Art Society, Margaret Newman, who will talk a little bit about the similar kind of issues in New York City. Margaret?
So thank you, Bill, and thank you for KPF and hosting this morning, and for Peter. We, I think, met in my previous position at the New York City Department of Transportation, so we go back a little ways, and I am new at the Municipal Art Society, and Bill and I are actually old friends, but new here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our work in relation to this particular issue. So, Ada Louise Huxtable once said, when asked what a New York City skyscraper should be, answered, soaring, shining, and glamorous, an affirmation of reach and power. And we continue here in New York to celebrate and love our great buildings, and we thrive and profit as a city on the possibility for density that they provide. This relationship and the motivations which drive the creation and construction of tall buildings is not always a comfortable one, as we all know, with many competing interests. And it would be interesting to give the same poll or do the same question that Peter posed in London. We haven't done that yet, but I think we'll try that one soon and see how it comes out. But we want development in New York to happen in a way that protects our public assets and keeps them valuable to the community. And I don't think I need to go through identifying these buildings, but it's basically a history of tall buildings here in New York. And I'll put in a plug for the Skyscraper Museum, where there's a really terrific show that if you haven't seen it, I think it's extending another week or so, which documents the history. So, skipping ahead, the rise of super tall buildings, and 6 of them, which are currently under development near Central Park, has recently pushed this topic to the forefront. And these buildings are unique for their height and their slenderness and their use. They are luxury residential towers that in many cases have only 1 unit per floor. buildings, which are mostly built as of right, are among the tallest buildings in New York, and there should be a way to ensure that the public has a voice when our open spaces, infrastructure, and skyline are affected by new development. And I'm not going to go into, as of right, what that means in terms of, as a zoning term. I'm assuming that most of the people in the room here understand what that means, but we can talk about that a little bit later in the Q&A. But it basically means there's no review process to build these. So this is a comparison of building heights. As you can see, the new towers, which are the ones in orange, are either approaching or exceeding 1,000 feet in height. So what are these issues? The advances in building technology allow extremely tall buildings on very narrow lots. The market's also changed. There's a soaring demand for luxury condos, leading developers in these areas to offer the best views, and as a result, buildings are being built around some of our most important open spaces. Obviously, there's a huge market driver that's propelling this and allowing some of these projects, which have been dormant for quite a few years, to suddenly sprout. And many of these, if you read the history of them, have been in some form of development or accumulation of properties for over 10 years. So it's not a surprise to the people who've been developing them. I think it's a surprise to some people in the city. So after development, this is what this 57th Street view looking north will look like. We have, I will just say personally, at 111 West 57th Street, where my offices are currently located, are victims of this particular change, in that the Steinway building is being developed for residential condominiums, and we will be moving our offices as a result. But this is not personal. So existing regulations are outdated. We feel that they're outdated, having been written before these tall, narrow buildings were possible, and therefore they don't sufficiently protect our open spaces, nor do they provide a predictable framework for guiding development. In the case of these developments, they impact important public assets in Central Park. And this is it. Whoops. Let me go backwards. I'm going forward. What happened there? Okay. All right, well, I'll continue. Anyway, the photo the image that I showed with the shadows showed the projection of these shadows as they will impact Central Park. So in response to these developments, MAS published the Accidental Skyline report in December 2013. It's on our website if you want to take a look at it. And the report helps to illustrate the collective impact of these developments and outlines some proposed next steps. I think the title is really key to understanding our concern. There was not an overarching plan here, but simply an accident of economic opportunity and zoning flexibility, which I think many of us in this room were not thinking about, and there were some very smart folks working in the development community who saw an opportunity and I think figured out ways to do these. So why is MAS involved? We have a history of being actively involved with development issues around New York City, and particularly near Central Park. In 1987, we organized Stand Against the Shadow, which some of you might remember, where hundreds of protesters with black umbrellas demonstrated potential shadows cast by the proposed Moishasopti towers that was then the Coliseum, which was a convention hall that was torn down. As a result of MAS's work, along with the Coalition for a Livable West Side, the project went through several iterations, eventually leading to today's Time Warner Center, which is a mixed-use building design to minimize impact on Central Park, and Jazz at Lincoln Center was a program component which serves the community and the cultural. MAS was part of a public forum on the topic, which was recently hosted by Community Board 5. And hundreds of people showed up. There were close to 500 people there, a range of local politicians that were concerned about the impact of these developments. It was widely covered, so I'm sure you read about Gary Barnett, who's sitting next to me there, had some interesting comments regarding his work, and it was quite a spirited discussion. And there were representatives from Peg Green, representing some landmarks, a landscape architect, and Michael, who's here today, was also on the panel. So what are some next steps? One of the things that we think needs to get done in the next period of time is to identify other neighborhoods and open spaces where similar types of development could happen. We're researching unused development rights and exploring the differences between built and available FAR, and a careful examination of where they might be next will allow us to get out ahead of these critical issues in other neighborhoods. This is a sampling, a kind of sneak preview of some of the research that we're doing. This is the Sarah Roosevelt Park on the Lower East Side, and they're color-coded by the amount of development rights that are available. And we will be, we're putting together another report, which this is not yet public, but we'll go into details. Developer can purchase available air rights in the surrounding block and use them to build a larger building through a zoning lot merger, which was how the, for instance, the Accidental Tower was built on 57th Street. So the kind of development that's going on in Central Park is really unique in many ways, but there are other types of real development pressures throughout the city. This is the south side of Prospect Park in Brooklyn. As you can see, there's not a huge amount of dense available development rights, but there are some that may come to be built over the next few years. This is Queens, Flushing Meadows Park, which is another area which has obviously quite an extensive amount of development rights that are available. And this is Franz Siegel Park in the Bronx, and they don't actually reflect height and setback rules, topography, or market demands, so they aren't really, we're not trying to predict where the next hotspot is, but they show where development will be possible. So the other avenues that we're looking at is researching and advocating for potential policy changes, including rethinking height and setback controls around open spaces, a performance-based set of criteria which permits adequate light while also allowing for new development, placing restrictions on large lot assemblages in cases where more than 20% of a site's space FAR is exceeded, additional public review should be triggered, and then improving transparency for zoning lot mergers. One of the challenges of the current process is the opacity of the transactions which pool development rights, and a more straightforward reporting mechanism would be important to knowing where and when these are going to happen. We're also looking at examples from other cities. San Francisco, which is shown here, has Proposition K, which is a sunlight ordinance, which blocks construction of any building over 40 feet that casts an adverse shadow on recreation and park department property, unless the Planning Commission decides the shadow is insignificant. In Boston, there's legislation that was passed in 1990, which limits development that casts shadows in the Boston Common Public Garden. And recently, there have been efforts to expand the law to apply to 6 additional open spaces in Boston and Cambridge. And then Fort Lauderdale limits shadow on public beaches by stipulated step-back development in certain waterfront areas. And we had mentioned London in some of our earlier discussions, and I was pleased to hear Peter's discussion of the view corridors, which has not been a major avenue in New York, but certainly something to consider. So New York's waterfronts, parks, and other significant spaces are all central to the development of new places for working and living. Planning ahead and identifying the areas of the city where we want to see growth is crucial to ensuring that our assets are protected and our skyline enhanced. New York needs to grow, and tall buildings are a part of the city's future, but we want development to happen in a way that is thoughtful and responsible and that protects our vital public resources. And one of the questions, 2 questions were posed in terms of my talking about this subject today. One was to begin to think about other areas where development might happen, which I think the maps begin to address. But the other question was to talk about whether the infrastructure investments that might be necessary to sustain these buildings are sufficient within the city. And I think one of the arguments in favor of changing and reviewing these is really that New York City is based on some, there's been quite a lot of recent discussion about the aging infrastructure and that New York City is lacking in funding to pay for that infrastructure. And anyone who's been here all winter knows exactly what I'm talking about. So that can these new structures, which are so highly profitable, is it possible that they can contribute in a more meaningful and more expansive way to rebuilding the city that we need to do? So thank you very much, and we look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, our next speaker from London is Wynne Rees. He is currently Professor of Places and City Planning at the Barlett School of Architecture at University College London, but prior to that he was the Chief Planner in the City of London and responsible really for the control of the soaring, shiny and glamorous towers that form the city cluster. Peter.
Well, good morning New York and good afternoon London. The London audience will be aware that my voice is operating at about an octave below the normal beautiful Welsh tenor that I have. And I have to explain that I have caught this head cold deliberately, because I know you guys in New York find deep voice sexy. So I'm doing my best. Welcome to London. Welcome to a city with history. London, as you can see, has been a city of skyscrapers for a great length of time. Sir Christopher Wren was a brilliant architect and a crap planner. And he had little idea of how to make places. In fact, if Wren's plan had been built, London would not be a world city today. We'd be a failure, just like Paris. That's a joke for you guys in New York. But London has had a history of tall buildings. The church towers in the City of London that Wren built after the fire in 1666 were skyscrapers in their day in relation to the 2- and 3-story buildings around. And they were built for one reason. They were not built to show people how religious they were, how much they believed in God, how grateful they were for survival after the fire. They were simply built to show how important each one of the parishes of the city was. And it was just a gesture to the next parish. It was just one finger. They were saying, we're better than you guys. They were showing off, they were boasting. And of course, Wren made a packet of money out of it. So nothing to do with religion, everything to do with boasting. Now, you guys in New York or in the US have a little bit of history as well. And in the 19th century, 2 things coincided. The first was a Mr. Otis inventing the elevator, allowing buildings to rise higher than 7 stories. And at the same time, US second city, Chicago, with a giant inferiority complex, burnt everything down. Those 2 things couldn't have happened at a worse time, because we all know what happened next. They invented the skyscraper. And again, they did it for one very good reason. Chicago is by the side of a very big lake, and even bigger prairie. Nobody knows where the hell they are. They were waving, or were they drowning? The skyscraper is almost always irrelevant as a building form, unless you've run out of land. And that's one thing New York and the City of London shares. New York is surrounded by water. The City of London, as the world financial centre in London, is only 1 square mile. So, once you've run out of land, up is the only way to go. That's why we created a cluster of office towers in the eastern part of the city, which Peter Murray has already described to you. Walkie-talkie, or last summer the walkie-scorchie, until the architect's screen was put back by the developers who thought they could save money by taking it off. And it's all right, Raphael, we know you designed one. Behind the cheese grater, that's the only one I've nicknamed, and the reason I nicknamed it the cheese grater was because I thought it looked rather like something Lord Rogers' wife, Ruth Rogers, would use in River Cafe to grate the parmesan onto the pasta. And I know I invented that nickname because it now says so in Wikipedia, even if I did write it myself. And behind the cheese grater, we see our very own gherkin. That was the one that changed it all. Until the gherkin, just after the millennium, people in London didn't like tall buildings. They had to put up with the crap of the post-war era, the 60s and 70s, the slab blocks, where we dumbed down whatever we could find from the States to build cheap, quick buildings. They hated them. But once they saw the gherkin going up and realized it was an unusual shape, and that it had character and personality, they started to change their minds. The press did everything they could, and our wonderful British media will do anything they can to make bad news. With the case of the Gherkin, first of all, the building was settling, was sinking. In fact, it was just natural settlement on the foundations. Then all the windows were going to fall out because one of the window catches broke. And finally, it wouldn't let because it was a circular building and desks are rectangular. All that failed. It became a success. The public loved it. So as the very last attempt to rubbish the project, the press came up with a nickname and they called it the erotic Gherkin. They thought that should do it. But the public looked at it and not only found it erotic, but rather like a gherkin, and they adopted half of that nickname and called it the Gherkin. They then turned to the planners of the city and said, where's the next one? What shape is it and what's the nickname? Which is why I had to come up with Cheese Grater very quickly, because of the distinctive shape of the Rogers building that was following along behind. Then, of course, the Pinnacle, or as I prefer to call it, the Helter Skelter, because that's the nickname we preferred, came along, and that will be the tallest point in the city at 300 meters high. And I won't translate that, I assume there's a simultaneous translation in New York. We're on new money over here. 300 meter tall pinnacle in the center of the city. That building isn't on stop at the moment for financial reasons or for lack of demand. It's simply that the bloody developer and the bloody funder can't agree what to build, which is a strange thing to do when you've half constructed the building. That'll be sorted out before the end of the year, it'll be back on stream again. All of this cluster is to do with one thing and one thing only, it's to do with making and sustaining places to work. It's office jobs. And if you have 20 stations and 7 underground railway lines, you can build greater density through building tall in the centre of an office location. That's what we've done in the City of London. So that cluster is part of London's economy. It's a strengthening of London's economy. It's providing the space for all those firms from all over the world that want to come and be in the centre of the City of London, in this business and financial centre. It's funded by the whole world too, because London is regarded as the least worst place in the world in which to invest. People from all over the world are bringing their money to London at the moment because they're more frightened of it being somewhere else. That's fine if they're building office buildings. The problem is, things have now changed, and people are starting to build a whole heap of other stuff. People are starting to think of London like this. This is the way architects tend to think of cities, given half the chance. How tall is line? How far can you see it from? And of course, the developers are very pleased to have more on the site, and the engineers are very happy to sell the architects the Viagra to keep them up. But we shouldn't be thinking of the tops of buildings. I always say it's more important to think about base over apex. It's what's down below that matters, it's the place. That's why I demanded in my new role as an academic to become Professor of Places, not just Professor of City Planning. It's the quality of the place that matters, not the show-off tall buildings that you construct. If you have the world's tallest building this week, you can be pretty sure by next week it will be the second tallest. And who wants that? Build tall because you run out of space and for no other reason. And although we have a cluster here in the centre of the City of London, a cluster of commercial buildings, beyond in the distance you can see these other clusters and individual tall buildings rising, almost all for residential use. These are piles of safe deposit boxes. We celebrate May Day in London, just like the Ruskies. And the Ruskies are coming and they're bringing their money. And they're piling them into these safe deposit boxes. They're buying apartments they're not going to live in, just because it's a safe place to launder their money. The Chinese are gambling on these apartments. They're paying 10% and gambling that they'll reach a certain price by a certain date. Arab money is coming here. Even US pension funds are trading in assets in the US to bring them to London in order to invest in this real estate boom, which doesn't appear to be a bubble that can be pricked because of the almost infinite investment market that there is for this property. This is trashing London's skyline, and for the first time in my life, I find myself in agreement with Prince Charles. If you want to build high-density housing, build donuts, don't build towers. At least a donut has some nice space in the middle, the jam, whereas a tower just has rubbish space around the outside, space left over after planning. So, you guys in New York, we've been told for many years that Miss Otis regrets. I'd like to think that Mr. Otis regrets too.
for, again, the New York version of skyscraper development.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was entertaining as always. And I always wish we'd have a Peter Rees and Peter Murray in New York. Our life would have a lot more fun. And that's one of the reasons we like working in London. Now, I actually, is this the button I pushed? This one? Yeah. Okay. Nothing's happening. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I thought I'd just make some comments on, to further what Peter was saying about comparing New York and London, and also talk a little bit about residential development and high-rise development that's not necessarily only for luxury. And maybe further in the conversation, the discussion will be, is there a need for residential buildings, one, how many residential buildings are needed, and is it possible to do it, is it better to do it with medium, low, and high-rise, or low-rise, which some people advocate. Now, the statistics are such that both New York and London, for the first time in many years, the population is increasing at roughly the same pace, which I believe is 100,000 people a year per annum. And over the history of the 100 years of the modern city, which I would say is roughly now from 1914 to 2014, if you compare if the populations are similar, the space needs are very different. The average individual in 1914 in both New York and London probably had 50 square feet per person. Today, if you built in New York City a bathroom by code, your first bathroom in your apartment would have to be about 60 square meters. So fundamentally, the space standards have changed. In fact, micro housing, which is of both interest in New York and London, the minimum standard is about 250 square feet for a micro unit. So that's 5 times the space that an individual had 100 years ago, or that would house a family of 5 by standards of 1914. In fact, the average person in New York consumes 400 square feet of space, and that's one of the reasons why I believe the demographic needs and the space needs and the code needs for more space, and one just simply can't do it in the traditional low-rise housing of row houses that are common to New York and London. In fact, space standards are actually slightly different, even in luxury standards. So the top line, you see comparative units in New York and London. So a one-bedroom in New York is about 1,000 square feet in luxury, where in London there is about 700 feet. But even if you escalate this up, this is creating a huge demand for space that maybe in the projects we've been talking about isn't really going to address that. The few apartments around 57th Street have about 2,000 apartments in all. I don't think that's really the fundamental question we should be asking ourselves about high-rise. The real fundamental question is how we house the 100,000 people per annum to keep the vitality of New York and London going. In fact, the demand in London is like 50% for foreign buyers of condominiums, and in New York it's only 30%. So most of the demand, by the way, maybe excluding the sort of towers for the oligarchs on 57th Street, is actually driven locally. We'll talk more about the emerging typology, but of course, in New York, the balance between city planning, art, architecture, and lifestyle have all gone hand in hand. And of course, in New York, we don't see the soaring towers and then the height as something that is necessarily bad. I think in London, there's a built-in questioning. There's a built-in questioning of building tall, which I think in New York we give the high-rise and to develop. In London, the mansion blocks that arose post-World War I were very beautiful typologies and answered many great needs and created a terrific value. So likewise, between the wars, wonderful building types emerged that are still relevant and still valuable today. Both cities have looked at this demand equally energetically. and you can see here the areas are roughly cover most of the city. In fact, they've been investigated and looked by the planning authorities to densify and to intensify development in a planned way over the last 10 years. So there is great similarity in that. Now, where these are quite sort of fundamental in their origin. In New York, sorry, I'm making this wrong. This is okay. All right. In New York, the focus is on the tangibles when in the planning procedures. So airline transfers, property protected, street walls are defined. They're built into the zoning resolution. Sky exposure plane is mathematical, and there's a finite plot ratio in developing any piece of land. 90% of the land is developed that way. In London, it's very different. The planning procedure, from my view, is about the intangibles. It's about the things that are actually quite hard to define. Strategic views, while they're perfectly logical in each building, they're not quite as tangible and as logical when you actually discuss it, and then they're subject to interpretation. There are no defined street widths in London because, as Peter said, London has a very long history. But also, even in the history of the gardens and the Regent's Park development, streets weren't necessarily continuous. And of course, there's a very wide range of street widths. And then, most fundamentally, there's no finite plot ratio on any site. So that creates a whole other series of investigations, which creates a fundamentally different approach that categorizes fundamental values inherent in the two cultures. And the real question is in the discussions in London, the Londoners want to know, maybe we need more rules, particularly on the large-scale developments which are showing a while they need to be developed, and the New Yorkers feel they need more composition. Maybe the New Yorkers feel that just designing cities by rules and mathematical and legal ideas aren't sufficient to build the city we need. So that's, I think, inherent in the value of these conversations we have. Now, I think the solutions or the responses to the housing demand and the need for the cities of the future are not necessarily in the strategic areas of around the Thames or right in the center near the City of London or near Central Park. But there are projects, large projects that are already underway, both in New York and London, that can house maybe 30, 40 million square feet of future development. In New York City on the west side, possibly 70 to 80 million square feet north of Hudson Yards or between 42nd Street and Hudson Yards and Penn Station. That's already planned, the infrastructure is already there, and that's what you see on your left, and built around an emerging plan development of Hudson Yards that will be the core center of that is well planned with sufficient public space to support the whole area. And likewise, I think in London you have on the east side, around Canary Wharf, Wood Wharf and South Quay, an enormous reservoir of development with fantastic infrastructure of Crossrail and the Jubilee line that will link you to airports and to the center of the city that will be able to house tens of thousands of people in a modern way. And of course in London you have lots of other developments. In New York we have developments as well that are planned in larger scale. One of the difficulties we'll face is we tend to argue about individual incremental developments, such as 157th Street. But then in the city, that's a sort of side aberrant issue. It's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is how you find ways to house the growth of the city at 100,000 new people a year. You can see here the future skylines emerging on the left. You can see the cluster on the west side that's been planned through the Bloomberg administration and will continue now. The blue is new, and then on the far left you see the clusters of needles that are developing around Central Park. And I must say, as a New Yorker, I love it and hate it, because you've got exonerated sites. These are really going to be beautiful, and you can't say they're not beautiful objects. On the other hand, you do question who does the skyline belong to. I think again on the right, you see on the far left of the slide on the right, you see the cluster that Peter was talking about. But this is the view, the historic view from Greenwich, on the axis towards a cluster forming around Canary Wharf. And I would say that's a great success, because you'll be able to house there maybe 250,000 people in a 21st century accommodation with standards of living and accommodation that are superior technically to the more to the more sort of historic and traditional ways you can live in West London. But the building codes the modern building codes wouldn't allow you to recreate West London anyway. So I think that the discussion should revolve around large-scale development rather than the incremental and more politically and potentially sort of exciting topics of how you address this. These are all the buildings that are already approved. The question is, how can we make it better? But this is something that is as of right. This is something that's going to happen, and I think over time we'll learn to love it. At the moment, it's really the shock of the new, and I think 157th, like the tower at St. George's, was not the best example of high-rise buildings. You've got one or two in London, we've got one or two in New York, but I think the following towers are going to be a lot better, and over the period of our lifetime, we'll learn to enjoy these. Around Central Park, which is obviously the cultural heart of New York. And the same, I think, is true of the cluster forming around the St. George's Tower 9 Elms. I think the first tower is quite shocking. Looking down the Thames and thinking how that's going to change over time is both good and bad. And I think part of the discussion now is how to make it more good than bad. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now we're going to have some comments from the floor. And we've got a few people lined up to start off the discussion, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. But to kick off, we've got David Williams, who's the Deputy Head of Planning and Building Control, London Borough of Tower Hamlets. Now, we've seen a couple of images of Canary Wharf, the new skyline that is happening at Canary Wharf. And so we're going to hear a little bit about what Tower Hamlets is doing to sort that out. Microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. From a Tower Hamlets perspective, just because we've got tower in the name didn't necessarily mean that we wanted all the towers that are coming in our direction at this moment in time. But nevertheless, we'll try and absorb as much of that growth as we can on behalf of London and on behalf of our local borough to get the benefits that we believe we need. Now, I listened very carefully to the presentations from both London and from New York, and one thing that struck me first of all was this concept of super tall buildings. And the question that I framed about 20 questions as I was listening mainly to everything everybody was saying, was how are these super tall buildings, and I suppose our version of super tall buildings as well, contributing to housing need and not just meeting housing demand? So that was one question. The second process that came out both in New York and in London was the issue of contributing to infrastructure, and this is something very close to our hearts as we try and absorb a lot of this development being proposed around Canary Wharf and in South Key in particular. And I noticed that Margaret said in New York, can these buildings contribute to infrastructure? And I think it's they must contribute to infrastructure provision, and they must take some responsibilities for the impacts they create, and particularly in the clusters and at the levels that they're coming forward in those clusters. Around South Quay and around Canary Wharf, we've not seen anything like that before in this country, possibly not in Europe, and it won't work unless the infrastructure and real thought is taken around how all of these buildings cumulatively are going to work together. I think it's really incumbent on us to think very carefully about the school's impact, the health, the open space, the transport, community facilities. And I noticed that most of the discussions that we've all just been having haven't really talked about the local community. Now, putting tall buildings in clusters is one thing, but the clusters have edges to them. And as we're finding out, as you get to the edges of those clusters, you've got cliff edges. And straight away, particularly to the east end of London, you've got very tightly knit communities right up against those cliff edges. And if not politically, they're certainly, from a planning perspective, going to create real tensions and real problems and issues for us as we try and make London absorb the population. And the final thing that I wanted to just kind of highlight, I guess, was that in the frenzy that has suddenly appeared, we're feeling that in town hamlets, but most of the work that the 100 or so planners and building control officers that we have actually look at aren't tall buildings, and they're not in clusters. And also most of the tall buildings that come forward, or a lot of the tall buildings that are coming forward now, should I say, aren't necessarily coming forward in clusters. And that's really beginning to test us, because investment isn't necessarily going to come from anywhere else at the moment for all the things we need. And we've got some difficult choices to make, and confidence to be able to say no to those buildings that aren't in clusters. And I think that's something that we're just starting to wrestle with. So those are the 3 points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Bill.
Okay, yeah, thank you, David. Our first respondent here on the New York side is Carol Willis, who's the director of the Skyscraper Museum. Carol, you want to come up and address the conversation today?
Thanks, Bill. Hello, London, New York. I'm a historian, and the particular exhibition that we have at the museum right now is called Sky High and the Logic of Luxury, and it focuses on the super slender, ultra-luxury towers that have aroused so much ire in general, so much interest, so much titillation, and I think indeed have informed a lot of the provocation for the discussion today. I have to say that everything that I've heard so far today, I'm almost in complete agreement with. I think Paul has given us an enormously enlightened view about how the high-rise fits into the future of the expansion of the city. I think Margaret has added completely new material to what I understand to be the debate and the concern of the Municipal Art Society to extend to other areas beyond Central Park the principle of protecting sunlight. I know Michael Portler wants to talk about that, and I'm completely in favor of those views. But to explain as a historian why New York looks the way it does is a different thing than to argue that New York looks great the way that it looks now because of its skyline. And I would argue both of those things. I would like to explain New York's historical progression to show the eras that play themselves out in the skyline. And I would like to argue that the super slender, ultra-luxury towers, which are a moot point at this moment in terms of city planning because they've consumed all of the available FAR. There will be no additional towers than the 8 or so that are in the corner because the floor area ratio, the air rights that were established by our 1961 zoning law are used up in that area. FAR is a cap-and-trade system, and I use that phrase that isn't in the law because cap-and-trade is something that I think most liberals favor, and I certainly favor. And if you're going to have tall, skinny buildings, you'll have tall, slender, sundial-like shadows. But if you're going to put a height limit on buildings, you'll have shorter, fatter buildings with the same FAR, and those shadows will be thick and long. And on small parks like Madison Square Park, where I live in my 31-story building, on a winter afternoon, my 30-story building casts a full shadow on the entire park, whereas the new slender tower moves across it and leaves sunlight on either side. So I think the point, the argument about the super slender towers, which we try to explain in our exhibition, and for those in London, I lead you to our website where every single word of the show and every picture is on the website to explain the phenomenon of these towers. I think it's a red herring. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the future of the city. What matters is planning the future of the city in a logical way, and a way that's fair. And part of the fairness issue, I would make the argument, is the system of zoning which we have had established since 1916 in New York, which we modified by a radical down zoning with a favor for open space by our 1961 zoning. And in 1961, we made many adjustments since then. Granted, there are many ways that the law has been changed through a process. But the fundamental idea of New York's expression of capitalism or desire, or whatever term you want to use to describe our skyline, is an expression of the forces of time and place that were established in 1961 by a system called as of right, that allowed people to create a building on a lot that gave us in Rem Koolhaas's phrase, the relentless diversity of Manhattan that is so glorious. That's the skyline in built form we want to look at, rather than the skyline of cast shadows, which is something that's always changing and which has hard to quantify value. I believe we should protect our public spaces, absolutely. I believe that we should use infrastructure, but I think multi-stories for millionaires is a better way to use our available resources than allow them to spread low through large swaths of townhouses of 4 stories that might better go to families that live on a single floor in the typical micro unit or the more highly utilized density which is the way most New Yorkers live.
Thank you, Carol. And now we move back to London and invite Ian Simpson, who's founder of Ian Simpson Architects, designing a tower on the south bank of the Thames at the moment, and also one iconic tower in the centre of Manchester, where he has an apartment on the top. So, Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a very enjoyable debate so far. We haven't come up with any solutions to any of it, really, at the moment. Obviously, Margaret's in New York, where we've already got 6,000 tall buildings, dealing with really, really super tall buildings, much taller buildings than anything we have in London, let alone the Shard. And having to deal with it through sunlight and shadow casting restrictions, and trying to get ahead of the game effectively by working out which neighbourhood's next. I think that's a really difficult challenge, but as Bill said, it's designed by rules. I enjoyed Peter's presentation, obviously reinstating the issue of placemaking, told us that nobody can design a worthy residential tower. I'm sure that a few of us would debate that, especially while supporting the design and the appropriateness of the walkie-talkie building in the city, which I would question. Residential tower, it's a typology that is here to stay. People like to live in cities. I know I do. People and residents actually enjoy a view. They enjoy light and enjoy aspect. Why is it just office workers that have that? It's sustainable, it stimulates creativity, and can add to the quality of a city's skyline. I agree, though, that there are lots and lots of new residential buildings that are coming forward that are not of the quality that they need to be, and they are starting to materially affect the skyline. It's not by default, and actually most of those projects have come forward in the last 5 years since the significant demise of Kohn. There's been no real debate and intelligent review of the designs that came forward. I know I spent 9 years trying to get planning permission on a building in London. I know how difficult and rigorous it is, and it needs to be that. I think there's a lot of projects slipping through at the moment, and what we need is a much more powerful, much more focused review period, not just for planning, post-planning, when the architects are kicked off and there's a delivery architect brought on board, and then it's all about pounds and shillings and pence. If we still have that in money. So I think we need to think about the steps that London can certainly take, and I think review is certainly on the top of that agenda. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Back to New York, our next respondent is someone who's looked at these issues in New York City for a long time, and that's Michael Cortler. Michael?
Hi, London. Actually, I was there about a month ago, and I hadn't been in London in 40 years, maybe below my age. But it's a dramatically different city, and had a chance to see many of the things that you've shown today. About New York, to second Carol Willis, actually New York has been a rule-based city since 1960. And as of right, development is the way in which the city developed. It actually is an accidental city. The city has never had a plan. When I worked at city planning, the chair of city planning at the time said, we have a plan, it's called the zoning resolution. And so we plan using the zoning resolution, we plan piecemeal. The only plan that New York City ever did was to lay out its street system, which of course has no alleys, and that's why we had garbage on the streets. But let me go back a little bit to some of the issues here. First, I think one would need to separate out the issue of the very tall buildings, design review, and so on, and that's worth a debate about whether there should even be design review in New York for buildings above a certain height. Frankly, I don't believe that. I think one of the things about New York is really the good you couldn't think of, and it had to do with people coming up with things that, having worked in city planning, people would not have thought of. And part of it is driven by greed. The place started as a company town, and it still operates that way. And I think it's one of the things that's part of the zeitgeist of the city. And the more we try to be like San Francisco, where everything is looked at, what we have is a very high level of mediocrity. I agree with Paul. I think a lot of what goes on here is what my grandmother used to say, but a human being can adjust to nobody should have to live through. But you adjust after a certain amount of time. The Guggenheim Museum became a landmark, the Whitney Museum became a landmark, and it goes on and on and on. And if you think about it, almost all of the fabulous buildings in New York, some of them that Carol has shown in the past, the iconic buildings, were all done as of right. There was no design review, and if there was design review, there probably wouldn't be an Empire State Building at the corner of 34th and 5th Avenue because it's out of scale. It's too tall. So I think, as one of the authors of the Midtown zoning, it works very well. I think what Carol is right. 57th Street is built out. It's a very bright street. It will continue to be a very bright street, higher, actually brighter than most. But let's go back a little bit besides this whole, and also almost everything in Midtown is built as of right. So whether you like the Chanel building or you like the building next to it by Portson Park, they're radically different. One is a postmodern building, one is a contemporary, we'll call it more contemporary French style. Frankly, I was thrilled as one of the authors of the regulations that there wasn't a design review and you couldn't have that kind of diversity that Poolhouse talked about. I think one of the things that's missing when we did Midtown, and I think it does require some rethinking, is the daylight part of it, which is performance-based, actually is derived from your law of ancient light and what can I think of? Anyway, the famous diagram which we modified for Midtown. So what we have is a real standard in Midtown, which is the daylight standard is based on a historical expectation of daylight. Again, another British common law idea of a continuing expectation. We codified that, and it actually was the same amount of daylight that you really needed to do task lighting, etc. Which leads to, I think, the other question about all of these clusters is that each of the buildings that are coming online in New York are LEED, either gold or platinum, which is great. The problem is nobody's looking at this on a district-wide basis, and what's the impact? Overall, I build something, I block somebody else's light in there. I block their light. Their lights are on more often. What does this mean at street level? We're talking about sunlight and daylight. We also need to talk about pedestrian level winds. The plaza at the Trade Center was a disaster because a 1,000-foot tall building that's sheer creates pedestrian level winds which may be untenable. So I think in general, when you think about these buildings, you need to think about them on a district-wide basis. And then finally, in terms of neighborhood parks and demographics and what the city has done, the city is essentially, with all of its rezonings in the boroughs, essentially downzoned the city. And actually, we don't really have a way to absorb this population at this point. And the population that's coming are not just oligarchs, but regular people who need housing. The city has not taken full advantage of the fact that we have probably the best transit-oriented possibilities in the country in terms of higher densities around those locations, etc. And I really applaud what Meg is doing at the MAS, looking at the potential shadowing of parks in the boroughs. We've been doing it for 25 years, maybe the time has finally come, and it may have been because, like all things in New York, something terrible has to happen before people actually do something. It's how we got the landmarks law after we lost Penn Station, and I think the shadows on Central Park, whether they're really significant or not, have actually created the environment for a real public debate about these things, which I think is wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And now I invite Sean Andrews, who's Head of Planning at GL Hearn. And GL Hearn were responsible for the research which we commissioned to look into the numbers of towers that were coming onto the London skyline. Sean, over to you. Could you stand up so they can see you? Of course.
Thank you. Firstly, good morning, New York. I've always wanted to say that, so that's something we can take off the list. I'd like to go back to this issue of residential need versus demand as a driver for the current sort of growth in tall building projects in London and now, as we've heard this morning or this afternoon here in New York. There's a little bit of a polarised debate happening in London at the moment. It seems to be coming out of certain quarters anyway. Tall buildings versus the green belt or the green land at the edges of London. The survey work that Peter referred to, we looked at, we tried to find as many of the tall building projects in London as we probably could. We probably didn't get them all, but we did manage to count 237 tall building projects at the moment at various stages of concept, planning and construction. But it sounds like that sounds like a sort of a lot of towers, and it is, but how far does it go with regards to dealing with the sort of housing issue we had in London? Well, 80% of those towers are residential, so again, that sounds like a promising contribution, if you like, to the housing figure. But when you actually do the numbers, we've just done some simple calculations based on typical floor-to-ceiling heights and numbers of units per floor. And actually, if all of those towers got built, all of them, all 237, and they all were in residential use, they'd probably generate around 40,000 units, which, as most of us here know, in London, it's about 1 year, less than 1 year's supply of housing that were required in order to meet need. So, tall buildings are only a tool for delivery, and I'm a fan of tall buildings in the right locations. But clearly, there's a bigger plan that's required, and the GLA is working on that here in London in terms of looking at suburbs and the densification. But the question really to you in New York is, what's the big plan for New York in terms of the delivery of the sort of housing numbers that you need? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Our last guest, Richard Anderson, somehow has disappeared, so I've been able to grab James Saunders, who's a different kind of authority on New York City. It's written a great book on it about the images of New York in films. I thought he might have something to say. So James is going to step in at the last minute here. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Bill, and hello London and hello New York. And I don't really have a prepared talk, but I was fascinated by many of the things that were being spoken about today, and what seemed to be so many of the different issues, maybe sometimes slightly conflated, but interesting to me as someone who has studied a bit of the history of New York and London as well. We glossed over the fact, we talked about the fact that New York's tall buildings have been controlled since 1916. We sort of glossed over the fact that, in fact, there were two very different ways of controlling buildings. The one that was created in 1916, and then the major modification, in fact, essentially rewriting of the law in 1961. And the reason I mention it is, in a way, they have very different philosophical underpinnings, which I think speak to some of the issues that we're talking about today. The 1916 law was more about the tangibles. It was very much about the fact that, most of you know, the Equitable building had been built a year or two before. It was this massive building, it was enormously tall, and it suddenly put 4 or 5 square blocks into shadow north of it, and these people who, the property owners north of it, suddenly lived in perpetual night, and were suing the city of New York and saying, hey, you know, how are we supposed to have some daylight here? And so the need for the idea of controlling shadow and controlling the impact of the physical size of these buildings and what they do to the cityscape became paramount, and we got the 1916 zoning law, the first of its kind, at least in the United States, which controlled very much the amount, was thought very much about the amount of light coming to the street, and made sure the buildings narrowed as they rose, and of course led to, we saw, I think in Paul's wonderful presentation, the old Hugh Ferris drawings, which created, and once you got to about a quarter of the size of the overall lot, you could go as tall as you wanted. So you got these pinnacles, slender pinnacles, which of course define the very romantic skyline that I've written about and became one of the great kind of filmic icons, and that, among other things, it became a symbol of the city and a symbol of the desire and power of New York. So that became a kind of a whole secondary issue. The 61 law, by contrast, much more about kind of modernist rethinking of the thing. The issue was not height so much as bulk and density. The fact that these big buildings brought with them lots of people in a small space. So the control began to be this FAR, floor area ratio. Now, importantly in FAR, the height of the floor is not specified. It can be anything you want. That's become a big issue recently, because one of the issues of a lot of these new super slenders is that they have very tall floors. They're doing these very high floors. So they're almost a floor and a quarter. I mean, Carol and I were discussing it, a floor and a third for every floor. So they're getting really tall. And that's true in commercial development as well. The new World Trade Center is 1,350 feet. You can translate it into meters in London. About, in fact, exactly the same as the old World Trade Center. But I believe it only has about 78 workable floors in it, as opposed to the 110 that were in the old building. And that's because floor to floor heights have grown in commercial as well. But the key idea was that it was the kind of impact on the infrastructure of the city that was the big concern of the 61 planners, and they wanted to make sure that there wasn't too many people in too little of space. The super talls have kind of thrown that on its head, because ironically, I don't think there's going to be any impact at all, in part because no one's going to live in these buildings, basically. And the stuff that Rees talked about is certainly true here. These buildings are being primarily purchased by out-of-town buyers, shall we say. And I like to say, if you don't look like what they look like during the day, don't worry about them at night, because there'll never be a light on in them at all. We've seen this in New York, that these buildings are dark at night, basically, because they're empty. And the safety deposit box in the sky is really the primary thing. And yet they are having this enormous impact. And I think part of the kind of feeling about them has to do with, why should all those people in Central Park be losing their shadows for either a long time or a short time for buildings which are basically empty or substantially empty? And I think that is a serious issue. And finally, I think there's a completely different issue, and that has been raised by a number of our speakers. Obviously, we're both cities that are having, happily, wonderfully, after many years of either declining population or static growth, growth booms. People want to live in cities, and they want to live in the big cities, and they want to live in the two biggest biggest cities of them all, not necessarily literally in terms of population, but in terms of stature and power and dominance. And that's a wonderful thing. Young people in particular seem to be mesmerized by the idea of living in cities, and we've seen lots of pieces about how young people are not buying cars in the United States so much anymore. People want to live in cities. And so they're coming, and they're coming here. And the catchment of New York and the catchment of London is the world. It's not just a matter of the oligarch. All the kids of the world want to live here. The French kids want to live here, and the kids from all over the world want to come here. So that's a terrific thing. We have to accommodate their growth. That's going to take a whole different kind of thinking, as some of our speakers have said. That's going to take the production of units on a scale New York has not done in 30 or 40 years. It's easy to mock the likes of a Robert Moses and the old 1950s urban renewal, but those guys got housing built 30 and 40,000 units a year in the 1950s, and we're really almost capable of thinking at that scale, but we're going to have to address the sorts of numbers that Paul was speaking about. In any case, thank you very much, and this was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and you can come to the NLA and give an impromptu speech anytime. Actually, that was a really great summary, and I am continually amazed about the sort of coincidences in the discussion and the difficulties we have in delivering housing at the moment, but also how we used to be able to do it in the 50s and 60s in a very more efficient way. But what we'll do now is we'll have alternate questions in London, New York, and I don't know if there's somebody in London who would like to start with a response. Oh, we've got somebody in New York, okay. Quick response. Good, okay, you fire away.
Margaret, yeah, come on. Margaret, come on.
Hi, thanks very much, because it's been really fantastically interesting. My question has to do with the politics of all of this. We leave out the conversations about planning and how planning is really influenced in New York, and I'm curious, and it's actually a question for London, whether you're dealing with the same kinds of pressures that we deal with. So we have the politics of very influential developers who actually are the initiators most often of the rezoning initiatives that have gone on in the last 10 years in New York, certainly, and I'm sure way before that. And then we have the sort of the individuals who are members of the community, for example, or also organizations like the Municipal Art Society, but we also have community boards, which are kind of appointed. It's a governmental agency, but they are citizens of the neighborhoods, and they are very, very powerful and persuade elected officials to act in a certain way. And then we have the planning department that shifts according to mayoral policies, and at the moment we're experiencing a shift in mayoral policy because we have a new mayor, and that mayor is primarily interested in providing affordable housing, and we've learned on a couple of recent approvals, very recent approvals, that the mayor is willing to go much taller in exchange for getting affordable housing. So all of those things are sort of at odds with each other. Communities that are trying to keep things low, developers who want to build things high, the mayor who wants to accomplish his goals maybe at any cost, and how we as planners, architects, interested people, urbanists, control the outcome so that it isn't just sort of willy-nilly haphazard. And it's actually a question to London, do you have these same problems?
I think most of the things you mentioned sound pretty familiar, and there were plenty of people nodding in the room, but is anyone prepared to respond here in London? Yes, Rosemary. Rosemary McQueen, Chief Planner at Westminster.
The issues are actually very similar, but at the same time they're quite different. Of course we've got a mayor, and you've got a mayor, and the mayor has obviously fiscal objectives, and we have the mayoral election that's coming up next year. But we actually have local government elections this year, and it seems to me that I think our local authorities, our 32 plus the City of London, do actually have a stronger role. And also the things that you were talking about, the residential community boards are slightly different again in London. So yes, of course there is strong lobbying by developers, property owners, in both the mayoral level and also the local area, and they are lobbyists not just in terms of individual applications, but also in terms of the policy making and policy frameworks are an important lobbying area, because if you can get the right policies in place, then your development process is going to be easier. For residents, at the moment, we have a changing landscape. There are amenity societies for most London boroughs, and in some, like mine, we used to have 90 registered, recognised amenity societies in terms of policy making and also in terms of all the individual applications. But legislation in the UK has changed. We have this thing called localism, and now we are actually setting up a stronger, what in fact central government is saying is they'd almost like the decision making to be made at the lowest possible level. And they are beginning to give a framework of decision making which will be legal at a local level. So what you have to do is, in an area, you have to first of all define an area and get the local authority to accept this recognisable area. And so we have 26 proposals in Westminster for areas. Once you have your area recognised, which is a geographic area, you can actually then become the neighbourhood forum, and all you have to do is show that you are representative, 21 people representative of an area. So let's take Soho, you'll recognise the area of Soho. That is a neighbourhood area, and it is now shortly going to become a neighbourhood forum. Once you've got a forum status, for 5 years you are the recognised body for that area, and you can then write a neighbourhood plan. And once you get it through a registration process, which is a bit like the normal plan making process by an independent inspector, then that actually trumps the local authority's plans for the future. So that actually shows that there is going to be, again, great, not just lobbying power, but almost decision-making power. But the difference is that these neighbourhood forums have to be representative of the area that they are. So, for example, in Soho, it won't just be residents that will be lobbying. That group has to also be made up of the businesses in the area, the universities and colleges in the area, or any other, in a sense, land use or occupier that's in the area. So it is a shifting landscape in London, which I don't think is entirely reflected in the way the governments of New York or the USA is working at the moment.
Thanks, Rosemary. Bill, have you got anyone in New York like that?
Is there anyone else that, Michael Portland wants to come back? Yeah, that sounds familiar here too.
It's too juicy to let it go. What you're embarking on is a really interesting experiment, and I think everybody in this room would really like to see how it plays out. The community boards that Marjorie referred to are only advisory. They have no power, so that the idea that you've actually devolved power down to these communities, that you're making them responsible, and if you think of it in terms of housing, it's like, you have a fair share. Where are you going to put it? You also have to deal with issues of garbage recovery and so on. And so by actually giving the community boards in New York some power, it might be more difficult for them to keep on saying no to everything. So I don't know whether that would quite work here, but I assume that London is as contentious as New York is, and people really, there's a pride of place. But I think all of us here would be we'd like to really follow this closely and see how it works, what the pluses and the minuses are, and hopefully learn from you, because right now what we have is, if the country is politically divided, the mayor is going to find that increasing heights in neighborhoods that have been contextually zoned is not going to be as easy as he would like to do. But again, this is very interesting, and keep us informed. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. We could have regular events like this where we could tell you what's going on. It's taking some time to get those neighbourhood forums together, but they are beginning, as Rosemary says, to have an impact on decision making. Anyone else in London who would like to respond?
Yes. John Walker, Westminster City Council as well. A lot of old office buildings, tall buildings, are being converted into residential. Office occupiers want much larger floor plates. They want to be going up from lots of different floors to normally operate, so they want wider buildings. So the old tall office blocks are ideal for conversion to residential, so probably there's a lot of employment space. Does New York have the same problem?
Anybody? Yeah, James? Yeah, we have a respondent here.
Hi, it's James Sanders again. It's interesting you speak about this. We've been doing a study. I'm working with Columbia University's Center for Urban Real Estate, and we picked as our subject the booming tech sector of New York and its impact on real estate and planning. And we found many, many interesting things in our early research. One of them is that the tech community in New York, this entrepreneurial startup community, overwhelmingly does not want to be in large office buildings. They do not want to be in what we would call Class A office buildings, which are sort of more modern, tall, very large floor plate buildings, 40,000 square foot floor plates. They like to be in older, smaller buildings. With, to their minds, more character, and in parts of the city which are mixed-use areas and not the traditional central business district. We've got a problem in New York, which is we have lots and lots of those buildings. Those are classified as Class B and Class C buildings in New York, and these were all the commercial buildings built from the 1860s and 70s, and really in the boom years of the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s. We have plenty of them, but we've lost plenty of them in the last 15 years or so because many, many of them have been converted to condominiums, to residential condominiums. Our last mayor, in fact, made it a bit of a kind of fetish to encourage that process any way he could, as a way in part to provide as much housing as he could. So many, many of those units are gone, and it's actually becoming an economic development problem for New York that we do not have sufficient space for this kind of booming younger tech group to open up in, because the older commercial buildings are simply not there anymore.
Thank you very much. Well, Bill, I think we're getting close to time. I don't know if there's anything you want to say from New York's end to tidy up.
Anybody else have the last word? I think we're talked out over here right now.
Good. Okay, well, thank you very much.
We need some more coffee, Peter.
Well, we must let everyone also get off to their day jobs, and I'd like to thank everyone on both ends for coming and our speakers. And I'm particularly pleased to hear Margaret's contribution. The MAS is, I think, a really useful body for any city like New York. And as some of you may know, a group of us get together. We rescued the London Society, which was started just a couple of years after the MAS in 1912 by Edwin Lutyens and various other luminaries. And we are actually looking very much to the model of the MAS as to how we will revive the London Society, make it a very relevant and wide-ranging group for London. And so very good to see what MAS is doing at the moment on issues like tall buildings, and we're looking closely at your activities through your website and hope to come and visit you soon. So thank you very much indeed. And for those, I don't know if you got them in New York, but in London we have evaluation forms. It would be really good if everyone could fill those out for us, because it really does help us make sure that we provide the best possible program for you. So thank you, Bill. I'll see you in Venice.
Thank you, Peter.
And thank you to everybody. Bye.